What's the difference between emotional eating and binge eating?
Emotional eating serves some very specific function.
Coping strategies and practical tools, how using self-help you get out from the circle.
The other thing that might be helpful is to maybe remove some of the sources of temptation.
You're really hungry, or just bored, or just feel lonely.
And how many courses have you taken on understanding emotions? And then one important thing to mention to people.
Welcome to Recovered Space podcast, where we discuss science and real stories of eating disorder recovery. Hi everyone, I'm Anastasia and I'm the founder of Recovered Space. And I'm thrilled to be co-hosting this podcast with Dr. David Garner, a leading expert in eating disorder recovery field with over 40 years of experience. Welcome, David. Glad to have you here.
Great to be here.
This is our second episode in our series about binge eating disorder. So please make sure you watch the first one because it's got a lot of insights and valuable information so you can get yourself equipped and be ready for today's episode. Today, we're going to discuss very important topics and very practical ones. We're going to start by discussing the differences in particularities about emotional eating and binge eating, what the difference and how people should approach it, how you should understand it. And then we're going to cover a lot, like big ground about practical tools, coping strategies, and ways how people should go and think about recovery from binge eating disorder or emotional eating in the most reliable and science-based way. So, David, I would like us to start this conversation, today's episode, with touching on the topic of emotional eating. It's very widespread nowadays, and when I was doing my research before this episode in particular, I've read through a lot of researchers. I looked in Reddit communities and Facebook communities and everywhere, and also have people around me who also kind of shared with me these concerns about emotional eatings. And the only question that they asked me to ask you, what's the difference between emotional eating and binge eating?
Well, I think that the difference between these two is pretty obscure because I think that there's not firm delineation separating binge eating from emotional eating. In general, emotional eating serves some very specific function. Now, the same can be true for binge eating, but I think with emotional eating, there's much more focus upon its function, what purpose it serves. So it may not necessarily involve large amounts of food. So you can engage in emotional eating, kind of emotional nibbling or emotional eating smaller amounts of food. Clearly, food, it can either be a reward, a punisher, or distraction in emotional eating. But again, the same can be said for binge eating. Binge eating just involves, by definition, large amounts of food consumed over a short period of time and with feelings of disgust or shame. And again, with emotional eating, it may not necessarily be intense feelings of shame. It may be much more related to self-soothing behavior rather than attempts to try and acutely interrupt strong emotions. And again, it may not have any serious distress associated with it, emotional eating. But again, the major takeaway point is that there's no firm differentiation or delineation, I think, between the two. It's more fine points. That being said, what kinds of specific triggers can be associated with the emotional eating? I mean, emotional eating it serves functions. So, for example, I had a client at one point who engaged in emotional eating, but it was pretty clear that the emotional eating was tied to intense anger toward her husband. She was just very angry at him having an affair, and so she was going to punish him by eating tremendous amounts of food because he was disturbed by this behavior, and so it was an attempt to try and express anger in a dysfunctional way. So it can be anger in a whole range of things. Sometimes people engage in emotional eating for other purposes like loneliness. They feel isolated and lonely, and food becomes kind of a source of reward. It's soothing, it's positive. And so it's emotional eating in the sense that it may not be for nutritional purposes, but it does serve an important function. Sometimes emotional eating can be related to experiences of trauma. So people will have visualization of the traumatic experience. They'll feel really upset or distressed. And the food tends to interrupt these images. So it's serving some emotional purpose. People can eat emotionally because they're depressed.
Mm-hmm.
They're depressed, and food becomes and the reward really compensates for some of the feelings of depression. The same can be said for anxiety. People feel very anxious, and the anxiety is attenuated or dissipated by this eating. So in that sense, since it's related to emotions, it could be thought of as emotional eating. Oftentimes, emotional eating can be tied to interpersonal conflict. I gave the example of the woman who was eating because she was angry at her husband, but it also can be other reasons, just angry at a work situation, angry at people, very specific people, or angry at a circumstance, like feeling that you've been undervalued by someone or that things have gone wrong in your life. And so therefore, at least eating provides some kind of compensation for these negative events in your life. It can occur because of financial distress. People get very worried because they have are in a financial predicament, and eating can provide something to kind of gloss over the negative aspects of that feeling. I guess the other thing, though, that I really want to emphasize, which seems very important, and that is we have a tendency to pathologize everything. And so we tend to pathologize the emotional eating. Well, I must confess that I always eat or snack for non-nutritional reasons watching football. I don't want to stop that. It hasn't had any major health consequences. But if I watch football, I have to have chips or something that will be pleasant. I'm not hungry. I just enjoy it. So again, am I a sick person that needs help? No. Or is it an emotional problem? I don't think so. So I really want to, I guess, for the audience, I want to make sure that we don't pathologize things which kind of are relatively normal. People eat for emotional reasons frequently where it's not pathology. It's because they enjoy having a snack while watching television. Let's not make this into a criminal offense or a psychiatric disorder.
Yeah, thank you for saying this. It's such a huge relief because one of the purposes that food has in our life, at least in my life, is fun. It's just,
yes,
it can be just fun. And and anyways, I really believe that it's very important we discuss this difference between emotional eating and binge eating, probably because helps us not to demonize this emotional eating when people really don't restrict in general. So because normally what I hear from people who are expressing their worries about emotional eating, they say that they don't restrict. And I do believe them. So I'm talking right now about like my people I personally know. They are in a very normal way. They don't restrict. They're good with food. But then here and there they can, use food to soothe themselves.
Again, a lot of people eat for non-nutritional reasons, celebrations, again, watching football, etc. So there may be reasons for people engaging in what we consider to be eating for non-nutritional reasons, which would be maybe emotional. But it has to do with degree. So in the example that I gave you of the client who ate in response to being angry at her husband, well, she gained about 20 kilos because of this emotional eating, because she was very angry. She really did not, her husband disapproved of this, in fact, didn't like the fact that she gained weight. So it was really an angry response. Or people that are very anxious or very depressed, and it becomes something that they do very often, and it has an intense soothing response, or it really cuts away a very aversive stimulus, such as re-experiencing trauma or images related to trauma. So if it's related to stress, anger, depression, anxiety, and if it's recurring, and if it occurs as a method of trying to deal with those emotions, as opposed to a more direct way of dealing with those emotions, or directly dealing with interpersonal conflicts, then I think emotional eating is something that needs to be addressed.
Beautifully said. Thank you. Thank you for this point. Very, very helpful to me. And I believe to a lot of people who are watching and listening to us right now. Is there anything else we want to say about emotional eating before we jump into a strategies discussion?
It's important, again, not to pathologize necessarily, but it's important if it is getting in the way of your life or mostly interfering with more sophisticated ways of addressing distress and discomfort, then I think it becomes a problem. I think sometimes people overeat because they say the food tastes good. Well, again, I don't know that this is pathology necessarily. I think it's good to have good tasting food. If it's excessive or if it occurs too often, then it may be a problem. But I think, again, emotional eating because the actual palatability of the food is high or it tastes good should not be confused with psychopathology. As soon as emotional eating becomes a solution or an inelegant solution to emotional problems, then I think it needs to be addressed.
Actually, this is the perfect segue for us to start talking about coping strategies and practical tools, what to do about all this and how using self-help get out from the circle. And I believe, as you just mentioned, that once food becomes the tool of coping with something, that should be coped with somehow. Otherwise, that becomes a problem. So let's talk about how people can help themselves, or what sort of help they should be seeking for if they understand that their emotional eating is a problem, and like what other ways or strategies people can use to deal with real emotions or interpersonal conflicts or whatever else, but not using the food.
Okay. So really, really good point. What kinds of coping strategies? Well, again, sometimes people with emotional eating do not engage in dieting. They don't restrict their food intake. And so obviously, if they don't, then strategies to inhibit restricting the food intake are not as relevant. But sometimes people who engage in emotional eating, it's not a clear distinction between emotional eating and eating in response to restricting. So one of the important coping strategies is to try and keep a food diary or a meal plan, as we've discussed in this app. This can be very important in terms of kind of a food reality check, trying to make sure that, again, you're not restricting your food intake. You're having plenty of nutritious food at different times during the day. So trying to monitor the quantity of food, the types of food, and spacing your meals out during the day can be helpful in dealing with emotional eating. Trying to move more toward the eating in response to nutritional needs as opposed to in response to emotional distress. So I think the second strategy, which I think is important, is really trying to, I guess, tame your stress. Many people will eat in response to stress. So you can either just try and decrease your emotional eating, but again, the most elegant solution is to try and diminish your stress. Why are you so distressed? What kinds of strategies can you use to try and reduce the stress? Then will reduce the need for a nutritional or a food response to feeling this sense of stress. So stress is important these days, and it's been linked to emotional eating frequently.
And can I please stop you here for a second? Because I really wonder if you can give us, our listeners, like a few ideas, what are the best tools to cope with stress? Because we hear like everywhere right now, here and there, about like meditations, about breathing exercise, about journaling, about different self-soothing tools. But I wonder, what's your personal take on it? What, like based on your clinical experience and experience with your coaching clients right now, really seem to work the best to help people to cope with the level of stress they have nowadays?
Well, it's important, as Hans Selye talked about talking about stress. It's important to differentiate stress from distress. And so sometimes people live fairly stressful lives, but actually they're invigorated by that stress. In other words, it's not really harmful. They just live in a fairly stressful world, and they're probably not eating in response to this stress. But if you have stress/distress, then it's important to try and do something to address that source of stress. And I guess one of the most appropriate strategies is to identify what it is that's stressful. For example, if you're working 70 hours a week, that may be stressful. You may not feel good about it. And so maybe trying to see if you can't have clearer limits on the amount of time that you're going to be at work. That might be helpful. What happens if you have a stressful job? Well, maybe you should evaluate whether or not this job is the best fit for you. So trying to interrupt some of the sources of stress. It may be that stress involves participating in a very demanding sport where you feel obligated to participate in this, but it also is really inhibiting the ability to do other things in your life, such as have meaningful social interactions or school or whatever. And so it may be that you've reached a point where you have to make a decision about, can I eliminate or reduce the sources of stress in my life? That's the first strategy. Then so you're eliminating in these cases external sources of stress. There are also internal sources of stress, such as feeling just very easily disrupted and disturbed by the events in your life. And in this case, you can do certain things like meditating, like trying to plan enjoyable activities, because sometimes people just spend all of their time working, and that's stressful. You need to interrupt this with times where you're doing pleasurable things, or deciding that you're going to work 50 minutes out of every hour. Then for that other 10 minutes, it's been shown that just 10 minutes of relaxing can be helpful. I know this sounds kind of a bit crazy, but I used to never believe in napping. Taking a nap was for lazy people. Well, I read the literature on napping. It turns out that napping for 10 to 20 minutes a day really leads to longer life expectancy, greater positive feelings in your life, and it may
Mm-hmm.
reduce your stress. So I would encourage people to perhaps consider napping or just
Mm-hmm.
doing something enjoyable for 10 minutes out of every hour.
Do you
So there are
nap
ways of,
now?
not at this moment, I'm talking to you, but
Good,
so
good,
not
good.
right this moment, but I do, yes, I have to confess that I am now a very happy napper. And
Nice.
because I try and, spend a lot of time in the health area and the disease prevention and the lifestyle, enhancement area. And so once I found out there was this extensive literature on the virtues of napping, I would be a
Mm-hmm.
hypocrite if I didn't decide to nap. So I do nap religiously.
Great, great. That's a good one. Okay, and then you had another strategy because I cut you off. Sorry.
Oh no, no, that's a really important one is again the internal ways of trying to decrease stress. It may be that sometimes journaling can be very helpful. Sometimes people can work out in some of their sources of concern by just writing them down. That can be very helpful. There's again a literature on the impact of journaling on decreasing your sense of distress. One thing that I do that decreases stress is sometimes I just get overwhelmed by the number of things that I need to accomplish. And so I do make lists. I make a list of things I've got to do today. And also that helps organize my thinking. It reduces my stress because when I go down that list and I notice that I've checked off everything on the list, well, I feel both a sense of accomplishment, but also I don't have this vague and overwhelming sense that there's something I should be doing, which I'm not, because I've actually completed the things that I should be doing. So sometimes it can be helpful to organize your life in some way that enables you to not believe that you're always under the gun and always have something you must do. I think another big source of internal reduction of stress is exercise. Exercise can be very useful. It should not be for weight loss because there's a lot of evidence showing that exercise doesn't really help with weight loss a whole lot. But what it can do is reduce your stress. You get your endorphins kind of flowing. You get there's a very positive both health response to exercise, but also just neurological changes, which can be very helpful in terms of reducing your experience of stress. So those would be the major activities. I guess one final one, which is very important, is that there's pretty good evidence that having really positive interpersonal interactions reduces stress. So trying to make sure you have people in your life that you can spend time with, that you can talk with about the stress that you experience, and they can help you process both the distress and perhaps even help you with solutions to the distress. But most importantly, just the camaraderie, closeness, the attachment, these types of benefits of interpersonal interactions can reduce your overall experience of stress.
Yeah, cannot agree more. And actually, when you were sharing with all of us these great strategies and ideas, I was like matching in my head, okay, how does it work to me? And to me, there is this feeling when you checked off all the things from your list. It's fantastic. I'm just feeling I climbed the mountain.
I tend to make a list of like 10 things that I need to do because my
Mm.
mind is filled with things I have to do. But then
Mm-hmm.
once I have that list, I look at the list and say, okay, what are the 3 most important things on the list? And I circle
Yeah.
those. So first of all, it's kind of like I engage in I guess, intellectual or emotional dumping and have my
Mm-hmm.
bigger list because that's more inclusive. And if I have extra time, I'll tackle those things. But the first 3 things on the list are the things I tackle first. So I both have a way of relieving myself of the multitude of things that tend to crop up that I must look after. And then I have things that are the first 3 on my list. And so that works quite well in reducing my stress.
I had a question around the topic of emotional eating. I would assume that this is very important for people to try to understand what specific emotions they are feeling in order to understand how to tackle them better. And I believe I'm pointing to the idea of emotional intelligence because what I hear a lot is people can get overwhelmed, but they don't really know what exactly they're feeling. When you don't know, it can be just harder to help yourself. It's just harder to come up with the ideas or strategies how to help, because if you feel angry or frustrated, it's the strategy to go about this is quite different when you feel stressed or anxious or anyhow else. So I believe my question is how someone's ability to recognize and check in with your own emotion can help overcome emotional eating if that's the problem for people?
Well, I think you raise a very important point, a really important question, because I think that if you just kind of think about it, we receive many years of schooling. Most people go at least through grade school, elementary grade school and high school and college oftentimes. And how many courses have you taken on understanding emotions? How many courses? Yeah, zero. I mean, both identifying emotions, understanding what to do about emotions, zero training. How much training do you get growing up in dealing with interpersonal communication? I mean, you spend most of your life engaging in interpersonal communication, but you actually have very little insight or understanding that you are developed through formal process of education. And how do you deal with interpersonal relationships or conflict? So I see this as kind of tragic in the sense that people come out learning physics, but they may not learn how to talk with people. They may not learn kind of the ways of kind of resolving conflict. They may not really understand what is depression and how do you actually address depression. How do you monitor it? How do you understand it? How do you do something about it? The same is true for anxiety. Much of our schooling produces anxiety, but it doesn't produce any solutions to anxiety. So I think it's really important for people to spend some time through their own reading, through this app, and through other ways of trying to formalize their understanding or their education around internal emotions, as well as interpersonal interactions and how to deal with people in a way that's more constructive. So I think that these are neglected topics. So no wonder people are in a quandary about what to do. They have no help. And
Yeah.
so, and they don't really necessarily need therapy for some of these feelings because they may not be clinically ill. They're just uneducated. So we need to spend a lot of time trying to help people to understand a bit more about how to identify emotions, what the differences are between emotions, because sometimes it's just negative or positive,
Mm-hmm.
how to differentiate emotions, and then how to constructively do things to reduce the destructive consequences of very strong negative emotions, and how to also deal with the multifarious problems associated with interpersonal communications.
Yeah, thank you, David. I'm really glad that we brought up this topic. I'm sure we're gonna, talk a lot more about this in an upcoming episode just to, again, to raise awareness because I am sure once you're aware of something, it makes it so easier to get better. Whatever get better means, whatever it means. But as long as you are lost in the woods and you're just guessing what it can be or why you might be feeling that way, it's not really helpful. So like this awareness and this education is kind of starting point, not only in the topic of emotional eating or eating disorders, but in general, how to live life to the best of our ability from the place of integrity in the best meaning of this word.
I think it's very, very important. I know I had one client who was really the valedictorian of her high school,
Mm.
and she then in her coaching relationship, when we would ask, "Well, how are you feeling?" She only was capable of saying, "I don't know." That was it. There was a complete inability to understand the emotional chaos that she was feeling. So a lot of work was spent in trying to coach her to become more aware of the nature of the emotions, to try and differentiate some emotions, and then try and develop more sophisticated strategies for addressing the emotions which were intense and destructive.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank
And,
you
and
for
before we
sharing
move
this.
before we move
Hmm.
on from some of the strategies that can be
Hmm.
used, I think it's important also to, in addition to the ones we've mentioned, to say that one of the ways of trying to reduce emotional eating is to kind of do, you might say, a hunger check.
Hmm.
If you feel that you're engaging in too much emotional eating and it's really become a bit of a problem, then really try and very explicitly note whether or not you're actually feeling hungry or whether or not there is something else going on. If it's something else going on, then being able to try and say, okay, now how do I address this undercurrent of distress that I'm feeling, as opposed to simply just quickly turning to food. The other thing that might be helpful in terms of food related strategy is to maybe remove some of the sources of temptation.
Hmm.
I mean, if you're engaging in emotional eating and you have a box of chocolates on your desk, well, they may haunt you.
Hmm.
They may say, please come and eat me.
Hmm.
So please try and reduce some of the temptations of emotional eating types of foods. If it's become a serious problem, you can reduce the temptation.
Yeah, actually, thank you for sharing this technique and tool like a hunger check. It's very helpful for people who don't restrict their food intake because there are signals of hunger and satiety. They're not broken. They're still working, and like it's very helpful. I do use this still, even though I'm recovered, but sometimes I do this double check. Like, okay, like, do I really want to eat this because I'm hungry, but I've probably been busy, been working, like didn't really put much attention, or like I don't remember when I ate last time, and I'm like, oh, okay, yes, I'm just hungry, and then I would like just eat whatever I like. But sometimes I came like, yeah, am I bored right now? Especially when like not much going on, and it's evening coming, and I'm just by myself. Especially when I'm by myself, when I'm without any people around, when I'm not socializing, I can be thinking like, okay, probably some chocolate or some crisps would have been nice. And then I'm like, okay, Nastya, you just had your dinner. You're really hungry, or just bored, or just feel lonely. And if I get myself in this very honest answer, I just feel very bored because I don't really like the series I'm watching, don't really have any other books to read. And then how the strategy I use, what I would do, I would call someone. Literally, I can call my best friend or can call my mom because we kind of in a good relationship with my family. Can call them just to distract myself because otherwise I'll go and get these crisps or a chocolate, which is not gonna bring me much pleasure. It's gonna be like something do out of bottom. And then would also help just go for a little walk. Always helps. Always helps. I put my headphones on, I put my favorite music, like we discussed Def Leppard or Metallica or whatever, and just walk, listen to music. And then when I'm back home, I've got a bit of endorphins in my bloodstream because of this little activity. And probably this crisps or chocolate doesn't look like appealing anymore.
I think you've mentioned the really important points, and that is that oftentimes emotional eating occurs out of loneliness or boredom. And I think trying to bring people into your life at that point doesn't mean that you shouldn't eat. I mean, you may be, if you find that by calling somebody on the phone and or going and calling a friend and getting together, you still feel like having a snack. Well, maybe it's fine, but it may be that the best antidote to loneliness is people.
Right.
And the second best may be music or some
Mhm.
exercise. So
Mhm.
when you're feeling alone, so trying to build those things into your life. And then
Yeah.
one important thing to mention to people, and that is that please, when try and do something constructive in the face of setbacks. If you have a problem where you just feel that you're either overeating, binge eating, emotional eating, and you really have kind of lost control over the process, rather than berating yourself, which can actually create more problems, it's important to understand that rather than this being a failure, it's a setback. And to be able to try and kind of say, okay, I'm going to try and do better tomorrow. Rather than, again, self-criticism and self-blame, understand you can learn from these experiences and try and implement some of the strategies that we've talked about maybe the next time around.
It's very important. Try to be self-compassionate. Self-compassion comes from the place when you really can talk to yourself as you're talking to someone you really love and care for. And once you have this enough resource of self-compassion, kind of gets easier to go through any setback you can be experiencing, not only in your eating disorder recovery journey, but anywhere in your life. It's just helpful to be a bit more compassionate because you are just human being. You're not a machine. You cannot perform 100% out of 100%. And of course, as we mentioned in one of the episodes, we do want people be ambitious and have high standards. It's all great. But again, perfection is not the point. The progression, that's the ultimate goal.
I really think, following on your point, I think that most people end up having a lot of compassion for other people, but they have an incredible amount of intolerance and criticism related to themselves. It's
Right.
it's always important in the face of intense self-criticism to ask yourself, well, if somebody else were displaying these behaviors that I'm criticizing myself for, would I be hard on them? Would I
Mm.
forgive them? Would I encourage them to be accepting of themselves? And looking at that double standard and how we tend to be so self-critical when we're indeed compassionate people, it's important to understand that.
Right. Thank you for saying this. So far, we've talked a lot about emotional eating and the ways and strategies what to do about that. We touch on the emotional intelligence part and how to navigate the interpersonal relationship, how it's all important, like in all overall in our life. That's clear, but especially when we're talking about emotional overeating because it doesn't look like there is any other way out. but like knowing yourself and knowing how to interact with the world and know how to protect yourself if needed or self-soothe you if needed, just not using the food. And I believe that it would have been great if we can discuss how someone who is suffering from binge eating disorder, when they do restrict their food intake, how these people should approach their recovery process.
I think if you're engaging in restricting and binge eating, then I think the first step is to try and understand the benefits of meal planning and to try and implement a very careful and thoughtful meal plan. Again, meal planning involves really trying to specify in advance, one day in advance, the type of food that you're eating, the quantity of food, and then trying to space your meals throughout the day so that it's not excessive, but it's not also too limiting. And this can be a very helpful strategy that is really a cornerstone of most attempts to try and address binge eating disorder, regardless of your theoretical orientation. So it's really important to do this in order to make kind of the initial steps in reducing the likelihood of binge eating. That's critical.
This is essential. Like I believe, and correct me please if I'm wrong, that everything we discussed so far about emotional eating in terms of strategies and important points to look at when you're recovering, they're still very fair for binge eating disorder and for any other eating disorder. But with the main, very important and essential caveat, you have to follow meal plan, or if not meal plan, you have to eat normally. I don't like to say the word normally because it's kind of very vague, like but what normal means.
I think most people really don't know what normal means. And so this is a way of operationally defining normal, and because people get confused about what normal is and get confused between normal and dieting and health food eating excessive health foods that are, health foods, not real health. So I think meal planning really provides a way of constructively dealing with disrupted eating patterns.
Right.
And I should say before, I want to also mention one thing, I guess, about kind of the binge eating versus emotional eating. I've been fairly critical of the whole concept of mindful eating with people that have severe bulimia, binge eating disorder, or anorexia nervosa, because mindful eating really is a very specific technique that's become very popular in recent years. Mindful eating involves being super aware of the sensory experience of eating, the pace of eating, just the whole experience of eating, trying to focus upon that. So not distracting yourself by watching television or doing other things, to be aware of the sensory experiences, to really ask yourself whether you're actually hungry when you're eating, to really try and explicitly try and stop yourself when you're full. But it involves mostly this the intense experience of eating. Well, I think so for people with the major eating disorders, of atypical eating disorders of certain types, because they're starved, their interpretation of internal sensations are disrupted. So to say, let's pay close attention to internal sensations which are inaccurate or disrupted is not going to be helpful. However, for emotional eating, where people aren't really depriving themselves, then I believe that mindful eating can be quite helpful and constructive, because what you're doing is really trying to spend time with the experience of eating in a more that enhances that experience, that makes food and eating more satisfying, really focuses upon the actual eating rather than eating in front of the television, making eating a more complete and more circumscribed experience. So I think, again, mindful eating can be a useful strategy in trying to address emotional eating, whereas don't really understand how it can be implemented with people who are having severe eating disorders that are characterized by food restrictions, severe food restriction, and usually by weight suppression. So sometimes it might be helpful to chew your food more carefully rather than just wolfing everything down, rather than eating too quickly, slowing down the process a bit so that you can experience it's kind of, on one hand, it's kind of the way that most connoisseurs of eating, they don't probably take 10 rapid bites. They probably enjoy their food and experience their food more. So I think that this can be helpful in, both making the decisions around what you eat, but also in the actual process of eating, try and, particularly if you have trouble eating very, very rapidly, try and
Mm-hmm.
slow it down a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than taking huge bites of food, try and, have more manageable bites so that you can actually enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
And also try and experience eating without the distractions that can occur. I mentioned earlier eating in a car. It's probably not a good way to engage in mindful eating. You should be engaging in mindful driving,
Driving,
but
exactly.
not not mindful eating in a car. So again, this whole idea of trying to identify the kind of the details of eating and experiencing food in a way that's more complete, I think that can be helpful if you engage in emotional eating that is not driven by these some of the other factors we described, such as
Mm-hmm.
disrupting intense emotions, etc. Because I think then you need to go to the source, to the core of the function of emotional eating and address that first. But
Mm-hmm.
then it's not a bad idea if you're just experiencing emotional eating to focus upon the mindfulness of eating as a
Right.
potential
Yeah.
way of enhancing the experience.
And thank you very much for covering this topic as well, because I had it in my list, and I'm happy that you kind of get to discuss it before I've been asked. So you kind of showed that like I'm thinking the same way you do. I believe one last question I have in regards to coping strategies and techniques and tool is this technique, as I see a lot in the self-help literature regarding binge eating disorder, is technique called urge surfing. What this even is and how it can be and how it can be helpful for people when they're suffering from binge eating disorder.
Well, I think that one of the most important techniques in dealing with binge eating has to do with trying to delay the actual act of binge eating. And during this process, trying to understand a bit more about when you delay it, what kinds of emotions or feelings and urges are occurring during that delay period. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that you can actually focus upon the, I guess, subterranean emotional environment during this delay period. And this can be very useful in trying to both interrupt the process, perhaps, because it may be after 10 minutes or 15 minutes, the urge dissipates. But also, you can try and experience some of the urges that you have, what's going on specifically during that delay period.
Thank you. Very helpful. And I'm glad we covered this as well. David, it's actually, according to my list, we discussed all the questions I had for today for this specific episode in our series about binge eating disorder. Is there something you want to say and to add before we finish for today?
Well, the only thing that I really want to add is the message of hope for people that sometimes people get discouraged because they either have not been successful at trying to address some of their eating concerns, or because they've read someplace that it is impossible to actually be cured from an eating disorder or disordered eating. And both of those things are just inaccurate or false. That sometimes people can have repeated attempts to try and get better control over eating, and either they're following the wrong message and in terms of trying to pursue this recovery, or they have failed and think that once they failed, there's no hope. So I just really want to convey to the audience that there is hope for recovery. I've seen many people over the course of coaching and earlier as a therapist. I've seen people recover from serious eating disorders more often than not, and particularly if they become dedicated and really devoted to the process. I think recovery can be an expected outcome. It may not be easy. There may be twists and turns to the process, but don't lose hope because recovery is indeed possible.
Yeah, thank you for these beautiful, encouraging words. And as we mentioned before, we're going to keep going with this series. In our next episode, we will discuss and shed some light on some co-occurring conditions like HDHD, alcohol abuse, probably diabetes, and a lot of other things that can go and cannot go together with the binge eating disorder. And so, with that in mind, please feel free to leave any questions about this topic or around this topic. So, we will be happy to address them in our upcoming episodes. So, Dr. Gar, as always, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking to you today. And I believe I'm just saying thank you from on behalf of all people listening to us. And see you next time.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to shed light on this very important set of problems.